My name is Lily. I remember the sound first, not the collision itself, but the silence that followed it, heavy and strange, like the world had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. When I opened my eyes, everything was blurry. Red and blue lights, the sharp sting of blood in my mouth, the disjointed voices of strangers saying my name like they were trying to keep me here, alive. I didn't understand how bad it was until I was lying in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms and machines clicking beside me. And even then, part of me still believed someone I loved would come rushing in, but no one did. The first night, I told myself they hadn't heard yet, that they'd come tomorrow. I counted the hours in quiet hope, watching shadows stretch across the ceiling tiles. Nurses came and went, kind faces and soft hands adjusting my blankets or checking the floor. They smiled when they spoke to me, like I mattered. I clung to that. By the second day, I'd memorized their names, but I hadn't seen a single familiar face. No mother's hand in mine, no father's worried questions, no sister. A week passed before my parents showed up. They didn't bring flowers. They didn't bring love. They stood there stiffly, like visitors at a wake. I remember my mother's sigh, barely a sound, but loud enough to cut me open. My father looked at the machines more than he looked at me. They stayed 10 minutes, maybe less, and then they were gone again, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and something colder, abandonment. My sister never came. I overheard 2 nurses whispering in the hallway one night. They didn't realize I could hear them. One said, "It's like the family already gave up on her." The other just sighed and nodded. And it hit me then, not like a revelation, but like a truth I had always known and never dared to name. They didn't expect me to survive. And maybe, just maybe, they didn't want me to. They thought I would die quietly, without fuss, without changing anything, without taking what they believed was already theirs. But I wasn't done yet. After they left, the room seemed colder. The walls didn't echo with concern or warmth. They swallowed it. Time moved strangely in that hospital, thick and heavy, with long stretches of nothingness broken only by the occasional buzz of machines or the shuffling feet of night staff. I lay there, bones aching, skin bruised, muscles barely responsive, and listened to silence more than I listened to words. Silence from my family, silence from my sister, silence that screamed louder than anything else. Every day I hoped foolishly, stubbornly, that they would come back, that maybe they'd had a change of heart, that something inside them would stir, some dormant love or guilt or decency, and they'd walk through that door not because they had to, but because they couldn't bear not to. But each sunrise came and went without them, and every absence etched something sharper into me. It was grief, but it wasn't for my accident. It was for the people I had lost long before I ever hit the asphalt. When I was little, I used to think my sister was perfect. She was older, smarter, always shining, in that easy, effortless way. My parents doted on her, and I tried not to mind being in the background. I convinced myself love didn't have to be loud to be real. But now, lying in that bed with half my body broken, I could finally see it. I had always been the spare, the one they didn't worry too much about, the one they never saw as essential. I wanted to believe this was all just bad timing, that maybe they were busy, overwhelmed, unsure of what to do. But the truth showed up in subtle ways. A nurse told me she'd called my mother about a needed consent form my mother hadn't answered, hadn't called back. Days passed, weeks. My recovery dragged on, stubborn and slow, but my family stayed gone. There were no calls, no messages, no tears, nothing. They had moved on as if I were already dead. And for the first time, I stopped waiting for them. I started listening to the people who were actually there. The orderly who brought me tea even when I didn't ask. The nurse who adjusted my pillows just right every time. The volunteer who sat beside me and read old books out loud, chapter after chapter, like my presence mattered. And it did. Just not to the people who shared my blood. Something shifts in you when you realize you were never really loved the way you thought. It's not sudden, it doesn't crack you open all at once. It's slower than that, like a fraying thread unraveling, tugging apart every childhood memory you once held close. I spent so many days alone in that room that I had time to replay everything, not just the accident, but every birthday they forgot, every dismissive glance, every moment they made me feel like too much or not enough. What broke me wasn't the pain in my body. It was the betrayal I couldn't deny anymore. When my mother visited those few fleeting times, it felt more like a social obligation than a maternal instinct. She'd sit stiffly by the bed, scrolling through her phone, talking about neighbors or grocery lists, anything except me. She never asked what I needed, never asked how I was really doing. My father was worse. He barely looked up from whatever report or spreadsheet was open on his laptop. He kept checking the time like he had somewhere more important to be. And maybe he did. They didn't come together after the first visit. Always separately, always briefly, always cold, and my sister Emma stayed silent. I hadn't heard her voice since before the crash. Not even a message passed through the nurses or a card at the nurses' station. I used to idolize her. She was always the one they pointed to when I didn't measure up. Emma gets straight A's. Emma would never wear that. Emma already got into Yale. I was the emotional one, the difficult one, the quiet shadow of her perfect light. But still, I believed in sisterhood, in shared secrets and childhood promises. I believed in her until she disappeared. People talk a lot about grief, but they don't talk enough about the grief of realizing someone's love for you had a limit and you found it. The strange thing is, as painful as it was, their absence gave me something unexpected. Clarity. In the stillness, I started to see who they really were. Not villains necessarily, just people with sharp edges who never cared to soften them for me. People who loved an idea of family, but only when it looked the way they wanted. And I was the inconvenient truth. The reminder that love is messy, imperfect, demanding. They didn't want that. They wanted me quiet, gone. But I wasn't. Not yet. And I was finally starting to see myself too. The hospital became a strange kind of home. Not because I loved it, but because it was the first place I learned to survive without pretending. I didn't have to smile to make anyone comfortable. I didn't have to prove I was worth loving. The nurses cared for me without expectation. The social worker, Miriam, visited every few days, checking in on everything from my medication to my mood. A night shift janitor named Luis used to stop by and talk to me about his daughter's poetry. And then there was the volunteer reader, Olivia, a retired schoolteacher who came by every evening to read out loud from old novels with worn corners and soft-spoken characters. She never asked for anything, just sat, read, and stayed. Those people, strangers, really became more of a family than the one that left me behind. During one of those long, quiet nights, the head nurse came in and gently mentioned something I had forgotten. The trust. My grandfather's trust fund, set up in my name when I turned 21. I remembered vague mentions of it, hushed conversations, backroom glances at family gatherings, the way my father's tone always shifted. When money came up, I'd always assumed it was far off, tied in knots of legal red tape. But apparently it was active, accessible, mine. The more I recovered, the more I remembered. My grandfather had loved me, quietly, but truly. He was the only one in our family who listened when I spoke, who called me smart without comparing me to my sister, who brought me peppermint candies every Christmas even when everyone else forgot I hated mint. He wasn't a loud man, but he was kind, and he made sure I had something of my own, something they couldn't touch. Not without me. I asked to speak to a lawyer. My hand still trembled when I wrote, but my voice was steady when I explained what I wanted. The trust as it was could be changed. I had that right. And in that moment, I made a decision that rewrote everything. If they had given up on me, I would return the favor. I rewrote the trust in silence, alone in a hospital bed, to reflect what love had looked like when everything else disappeared. I named names. I made sure the people who helped me survive would be the ones to benefit, not the ones who waited for me to die. And I did it without apology. When the hospital finally discharged me, I didn't tell anyone. No calls, no social media post, no update through a friend of a friend. I signed the release forms with a steady hand and walked out the side door with nothing but a donated suitcase and a copy of the trust tucked deep in my bag. My body still ached with every step, and my strength was nowhere near what it had once been, but I walked out on my own. And that mattered more than anything else. Miriam had found me a place. Small, tucked behind a laundromat, the kind of apartment no one looks twice at. It was perfect. No one would find me unless they actually cared to look. And I already knew they wouldn't. I bought a prepaid phone and left it off most days. The silence was louder now, but it didn't hurt. The same. It was mine. I learned to cook again slowly. I burned things at first, cursed under my breath with shaky laughter. I took short walks around the block and came back gasping but alive. I read the same books Olivia used to bring, now with my own voice in the quiet, letting the words become mine. Time passed in softness. I stopped checking the mail expecting anything. I stopped imagining Emma's number lighting up my screen. My parents didn't try to contact the hospital. They didn't report me missing. They didn't send word through a lawyer or a mutual acquaintance. Not even a single "Are you alive?" From the people who were supposed to love me the most. They weren't grieving. They were waiting for paperwork, for confirmation, for death. It's strange what grief becomes when it's not shared. I wasn't mourning what had happened to me anymore. I was mourning what never existed. The family I thought I had. The idea that blood meant something more than convenience. That a daughter was more than a line on a family tree every day. I didn't hear from them confirmed what I already knew. They were gone long before I left. But I was still here. Still breathing. Still healing. Still mine. And the best part? They had no idea what was coming. In that tiny apartment, with its cracked walls and humming pipes, I began to rebuild, not just my life, but something deeper, something more sacred. Myself. The girl who used to shrink to fit their expectations was gone, burned away in the fire of being left behind. What remained was raw, quiet, and startlingly strong. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden epiphany in the mirror, just a slow, aching work of waking up each day and choosing to live without their approval. But I wasn't alone. They didn't know where I was, but the people who had truly seen me never asked for an address. They found me in other ways. Luis, the janitor with warm eyes and stories that made me laugh when it hurt too much to smile, mailed me a drawing his daughter had made of the girl who beat the machines. Olivia left a bag of books at the hospital with a note, "For when you're ready to come back to stories." And Miriam checked in every week like clockwork, always asking first, "Do you want to talk today?" She never pushed, just offered. They didn't need blood to stay. They didn't need to be reminded that I was still here. They showed up in ways that mattered. I found a job shelving books at a second-hand bookstore. Quiet work that let me be invisible when I needed to be, and surrounded by stories when I didn't. Every worn spine I touched felt like a small piece of someone else's survival. I collected their words, let them echo in my chest. Characters who had lost more than I had, and still stood. I read them aloud at night, like Olivia used to do for me, as if I could fill the empty corners of the apartment with voices braver than mine. There were hard nights. Of course there were. Grief doesn't vanish just because you stop expecting an apology. But the pain dulled, shifted, became something I could carry without crumbling. I stopped asking why they didn't love me enough to stay. I started asking why I spent so long begging for crumbs. Love wasn't supposed to feel like starvation. And those who stayed, they fed something in me I didn't know was still alive. Time has a strange way of catching up with you. I didn't mark the days on a calendar, but I always knew the date was coming. The trust was scheduled to be released exactly 1 year after my grandfather's death. It was a quiet countdown that lived in my bones more than on paper. I carried it with me every day, not with fear, but with anticipation. I imagined them preparing. My parents, always so precise, likely had already spoken with lawyers, accountants, maybe even financial planners. They would have practiced their solemn faces in the mirror, chosen their mourning outfits in advance. My sister, I imagined, would wear something tasteful in black, her expression neutral, lips set in that practiced pout she used for sympathy and success. I wondered if they would bring flowers to the reading, some symbolic gesture to show how deeply they were grieving the girl they never looked for, They would never expect what was waiting for them. I'd rewritten the trust months earlier. It had taken days of paperwork and quiet determination, every clause reviewed and stamped with the weight of truth. I named the nurse who sat with me during panic attacks. I named the hospital's patient care team, the social worker who found me shelter, the reader who brought me back to life through fiction. I didn't leave a cent for guilt. I didn't leave space for blood. And I wrote a letter. Not a rage-filled monologue or a dramatic declaration. Just the truth. Calm, measured, painful. I told them what it felt like to wait in that hospital bed, to watch the door, to wonder if I was worth the inconvenience of love. I told them how I didn't die, how I healed, how strangers became my family when they couldn't even bother to pretend, and how this money, this inheritance they were waiting on wasn't payment for their neglect. It was a mirror, and I wanted them to see themselves. As the date crept closer, I didn't waver. I didn't second guess. I baked banana bread with bruised fruit. I organized books by color and whim. I took long, slow walks in the rain, feeling the weight of each breath like a miracle. They were waiting for their reward, but I was the one who had already won. The day came like any other. Birds chirping, traffic humming outside my window, the quiet rhythm of life continuing without drama. But I knew, somewhere across town, maybe in the lawyer's office my grandfather once trusted, they were gathering. They would have driven in early, maybe with matching coffee cups and their well-rehearsed grief. I could almost picture it: my mother's pearls, my father's solemn nods, my sister's strategic smudged eyeliner, all of them dressed in black, as if mourning was something they could wear convincingly. They didn't know I was alive. That thought kept me company all morning. They believed I had vanished, completely gone, passed on, forgotten. And that belief had suited them, I think. It allowed them to feel blameless. It gave them the illusion that they were owed something for their loss, but I wasn't lost. I had simply chosen to stop showing up where love wasn't returned. I didn't need to be there to see it unfold. The letter I had written would be waiting, neatly folded, tucked inside the trust's final packet. It was dated and signed in my careful handwriting, the same handwriting that had once written birthday cards they ignored and letters they never responded to. But this one they couldn't skip over. This one had weight. It was legally bound to be read aloud. I sat in my apartment that morning with a cup of lukewarm tea, staring out the window, imagining their faces, the shifting expressions, the confusion first, then the realization, then the rage they'd tried to hide behind tightened jaws and polite smiles. I imagined my sister's hands curling into fists beneath the table, my father's eyes narrowing, my mother's sharp inhale as the words cut deeper than any silence I ever endured. To the family that let me die alone. That's how it began. Simple, honest, a blade wrapped in truth. I didn't name their betrayals one by one. I didn't have to. I spoke of love, of absence, of what it means to be chosen and what it means to be discarded. And then I named those who had stayed. The ones who never shared my last name but held my heart. The ones who would receive every cent. And in that moment, I stopped being the girl they abandoned. I became the woman who left them behind. I imagined the silence was suffocating when the lawyer unfolded the letter. That heavy kind of silence that swallows a room whole, leaving no air, no place to hide. Maybe they were still smiling, still nodding politely as the reading began, still pretending to be a family in mourning. But I know the moment the first words were read, the mask must have slipped. They expected a will, a transaction, a windfall. They did not expect a confession. They did not expect me to speak from beyond what they thought was the end. But I hadn't written it for drama. I'd written it because they deserved to know what they had done, not with screams or confrontation, but with clarity, with the kind of truth that doesn't shout. It just stares back, unwavering. I waited for you. The letter began. In a hospital room where days blurred into nights and pain was my only constant, I waited for someone to care enough to come. You didn't. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I just told them what it was like to lie in that bed and realize that the people I loved most were hoping for my end, not because they were evil, but because it was easier, cleaner, more profitable. I didn't die, I wrote, but I saw everything clearly. I named the people who saved me, Miriam, Luis, Olivia. I described how they showed up without obligation, without blood ties, without promises. Just kindness. The kind that lingers. The kind that mends things. No doctor can fix. I said their names slowly, intentionally, and with the gratitude my own family never earned. The letter ended with no dramatic signature, no final curse or flourish. Just this: the inheritance will go to those who gave me life when you waited for me to lose it. They must have sat there stunned, searching for loopholes, grasping for explanations. But there weren't any. The documents were sealed, the assets reassigned. There was nothing to fight for, only something to live with. And I hope they do. I hope every time they tell this story, they have to lie a little to soften the parts where they abandoned their own. Or maybe, if I'm lucky, they'll remember it exactly as it was, and it'll haunt them. Not like a ghost, but like a truth they never outran. That I lived. And I left them empty-handed. I didn't go back to the hospital right away. It took time. Time to let the dust settle. Time to breathe without flinching, to exist without the weight of old expectations. But when I finally did return, I walked through those sliding glass doors not as a patient, not as someone broken or waiting to be saved, but as someone whole, someone choosing where her love belonged. The receptionist smiled at me, like I was someone they remembered, someone they'd missed. And maybe I was. I visited Miriam first. She cried when she saw me, not out of sadness, but that soft joy that comes from witnessing someone rise. She hugged me so tight I could feel the months fall away. Then I found Luis in the corridor outside the ICU, still pushing that mop like it was an extension of himself. He grinned, toothy and bright, and called me Miracle Girl like always. And Olivia, sweet Olivia, met me in the hospital garden with a bag of books and a thermos of tea. She didn't say much. She just reached for my hand and held it like I'd never left. That was my inheritance. Not money, though I had given them that. Not charity or obligation, but remembrance, connection, proof that love, when it's real, doesn't ask for titles or bloodlines. It simply stays. Later that week, I stood at the new patient lounge that had been built with part of the trust. The plaque on the wall was simple, not boastful, not grand. Just a name in honor of Lily Hart for the ones who stayed. I touched the engraving, not to see if it was real, but to remind myself that I was. My name wasn't carved in marble, in some cold cemetery. It wasn't a footnote in my family's quiet shame. It was etched into the place where my story truly began, where I fought to live, where I learned who I was, where strangers became something more than I'd ever known love to be. They may have written me off, but I wrote myself back in, and now, when people speak my name, it won't be with pity or loss. It will be with warmth, with pride, with memory that lives where love still does.